Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is Jess Walter, author of The Angel of Rome, published by Harper, and it will be released on June 28th. Jess is the author of The Cool Millions, We Live in Water, Beautiful Ruins, which we spoke about that with Jess back in 2012, which is impossible, but nonetheless. The Financial Lives of the Poets, The Zero, Citizen Vance, Land of the Blind, Overtumbled Graves, and Ruby Ridge. His work has also appeared in many anthologies and periodicals, including New York Times, Washington Post, Boston Globe. So, The Angel of Rome, which is also the title story, harkens back, as everyone says, and he admits, to Beautiful Ruins. And the cover kind of amplifies that connection, which is a great cover, like the other one. But there are 11 other stories that are equally grand. So basically, we have a record album of a book, except they're all hits. So you can laugh out loud at parts of this story, each story, which I did, much to the irritation of my sleeping wife. And you can sigh or sympathize or long for something, but seldom can you do all of those at the same time, but at least none of those will wake her up. So I love short stories. And the thing I like most, I think, is after you finish one, you may lay the book face down, open on your knee, or in my case, your chest, and just ponder and maybe even take the characters down some road of your own creation. So owning a bookstore, I've been telling everybody about this book, but I can't show it to them. So today is the summer solstice and I have a week to go. So hi, Jess, thanks for coming to see me every 10 years.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. It's good to see you again. It's apparently whenever I write about Italy, that's when I get to talk to you.
That's a good point. Well, since it's been 10 years, what have you learned in that decade?
Boy, probably much less than I've forgotten. But I think, as a parent and as someone losing parents, you learn a lot about love and grief. And maybe as a writer, I have learned to trust when I'm feeling emotional and trust when something strikes me as funny. So maybe I've learned to trust my emotional instincts on the page, if not always my craft instincts.
Yeah, but when you have kids, that gauge becomes much more, you can see it a lot clearer. Of course, now with my children.
So poignant. Yeah. And my youngest just graduated college. So I feel a little like a salmon that has done its purpose and just waiting for a bear to scoop me up and finish me off, man.
And he's like 11 or 12 then.
Yeah.
Now I have grandchildren in those 10 years.
Wow, congrats. Yeah.
Thanks. But it only seems like 2 years to me because your damn Beautiful Ruins is still on my front table and I see it as soon as I walk in the store and I can't get rid of it because it keeps selling. There's like, I want to get something else in there. But the good thing about it, it's always a go-to book to recommend if you're like tongue-tied. If someone requests something that's really good, you can just pick it up, which is great. So
yeah, that's nice to hear. Yeah.
It's definitely true, 100% true. It's there with Circe and Achilles.
Wow. Oh, that's wonderful.
And Gentlemen in Moscow and Rules of Civility. They just go on and on and on.
Oh, that's great.
So you want to go ahead and, okay. Last time we spoke, I listened to a little bit of it. I think I talked about every single person in Beautiful Ruins and told you my opinion. But let me do that. And then you said something gently that was very nice. You said, they're not people, Sam, they're characters.
I sometimes forget they're just letters on a page. I think that is kind of the great thing. And it's when I know a story works is I start, especially a short story, I start to feel like I've just found some fragment of a real person's life and gotten it down and moved on to the next one. So that's flattering. And it's the thing I love about stories too. I think sometimes for readers, it's hard to finish one, love it, and then have to move on and start over. they sort of want to live in that particular world a little longer. And with 12 stories like this one, you're probably not going to love all of those characters and those situations equally. And so I think sometimes people just want to linger a little longer. I find when I read story collections, I sometimes don't read them in order, or if I particularly love one, I take a couple of days off before I dive back in, because I want to just luxuriate in that feeling a little bit.
I can't do that. So I can't lay in bed too often because my neck starts hurting. So I have a really nice reading chair in the bedroom. I just sat there.
Yeah.
That was it, 2 hours.
Wow, that's so great to hear.
So Mr. Voice, this is the first one. And it was great. And it's not often that you read a short story or any book about two beautiful women who have 10. And it's really interesting, that viewpoint. So there's two things, I guess. We talk about Tanya's mom's bank account of beauty, but you also how do you, and it's almost like you could be accused of cultural appropriation now. How do you get the voice of these women? Because there's several stories in which you do create those voices.
I mean, I think that the issue of cultural appropriation for writers is real. There was a time when we waited for one of the grand men of literature to tell us about what life was like in the Caribbean, or, we waited for Graham Greene to tell us what life was like in Vietnam, and I do think that's an issue. I don't think, I think you'd have to just to have lived an incredibly isolated life to not be surrounded by women, to not be able to write from the point of view of a woman. And so for me, writing in Tanya's point of view wasn't that hard. I have daughters, I have a mother. I hope I'm a sensitive person who pays attention to things, but I also honor the fact that these characters are very different from me. And I take very seriously the idea that I don't know what it's like to be inside that life. So usually when I finish stories about, with a character who is gay, or a character who is of a different ethnicity than me, I'll show it to someone and say, anything strike you as false in here? And with that one, having women in my life, it was really easy to sort of ask them. But yeah, there's that moment of the story that I love, when Tanya remembers her mother's advice, when she says, your looks are like a bank account, and one day you'll have to spend the money. And it's such a cynical thing to say to a pretty 8-year-old girl. And so it's really a powerful moment in the story, and it kind of frames what happens as her mother basically marries a man who in this town, who in Spokane is the voice of the city, Mr. Voice, who narrates everything on radio in that town. And it's a voice I totally remember from my childhood. There was no actual Mr. Voice, but I remember turning on the AM radio and, hearing this guy say, live at the Spokane Coliseum, we're going to turn it into a giant mud pit. We've got the tractor trailers, and this big, deep voice. And so hearing that voice, I wanted to recreate that 1970s moment when the kids that I envied had those speaker boxes in their house where they could talk to each other. And Spokane had a World's Fair in 1974. So those elements sort of started. And then when I realized it was this young woman telling the story, it also became about parenthood. And that's such a universal thing. The first word of the story is mother. Mother was a stunner. And the last word of the story is father. And for me, it was a sort of framing of what parenthood actually means. So I am not an expert on what it means to be a beautiful woman at all, but I do consider myself to be fairly versed in parenthood and able to write a story from a lot of different vantages as a parent, or as someone who has parents.
Yeah, it's so funny because you do it in a lot of the stories. First of all, that first line is like the poet in you, like you sometimes talk about. Mother was a stunner, and she's kind of a mother, and he's kind of a father, but not in the sense that you would normally expect. And the other thing you do all the time, which is great, is like when you describe Mr. Voice, you have a picture in your mind and you go, oh, ugh. And then he turns out to be, as many of your characters, a really nice, good, really good guy. But you don't expect that at first. At least I didn't. I didn't expect that, other than the fact when he kisses her on the forehead at the wedding.
Yeah, I think to me, it's not about nice or good. Often with characters, it's about depth, and every character has their own motivations and their own wants, and we are often surprised by people. And I think, especially in a story about physical attraction, to describe Mr. Voice as looking, with sort of mod hair like a 1970s Ben Franklin, and here he has this, he's married this beautiful woman and is helping to raise her daughter. I think you play gently with the reader's expectation, but it was also a surprise to me too. It's one of the things I love about writing short stories, and it's the reason I don't tend to devise the entire story first, because I also want to be surprised by people. And then and sort of, I really wasn't sure where that story was going to go, and then when it arrived at the place that it did, I felt moved, and that's usually when I know I've gotten somewhere with a story.
I think you have Ben Franklin reference in the first and the second story. I can't remember where it was in the second story, but he's in there twice. But anyway,
Yeah.
the second story is Fran's friend has cancer, and this is where I laughed out loud. And I always want to ask you if you did. When you say, I wonder who would order a poached egg or a perverse Cobb salad, which is so funny, because the day after I read the story, I was sitting with someone and she said, I hate Cobb salad. Everything is so stacked up. And I couldn't explain to her why that was, but
yeah.
So did you know how, you research a lot. So did you know how the Cobb salad was named?
No, I just made that up. That was not a moment of research. Was it actually named after Ty Cobb?
It was named after Bob. Well, some people think it is, but it was named after this guy named Bob Cobb at the Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think I did end up looking that up. Yeah. That was a fun story. As a writer in training, I often just went and sat in restaurants and coffee shops and wrote down dialogue. And I was thinking about that and thinking about just sort of how funny and kind of arrogant that is, to imagine you can, just hear some snippets of conversation and create characters out of them. And so I was in New York, and I didn't actually hear any of these conversations, but I gave myself the challenge of writing a sort of cubist conversation where 4 different conversations are going on at once, and they just dip back and forth into them. And it strikes me as true to the way people talk sometimes. And then that I'm glad you laughed at those lines, because I had so much fun just writing that couple irritating one another with their conversation and talking about the menu.
Do you ever actually laugh out loud when you write a sentence?
I do. I cry and I laugh, and I'm just a sappy doofus when I'm at the keyboard, but I often laugh out loud, and especially when something surprises me. I think when he called the Cobb salad perverse, I also laughed. I just thought it was such a, something like that will, sometimes I actually have to reject my own stories that are nothing but jokes, that are nothing but funny. But if the humor adds to the pathos, then I usually feel like it's going where I want it to.
Yeah, that's like what I said in the introduction. You're laughing, but at the same time, what you were saying in that other interview about Kafka, there's always hope except for us.
Yeah, except for us. Yeah, which I find to be the loveliest epitaph. Yeah.
The other thing is that, James Joyce wrote the Nighttown episode of Ulysses, like basically just writing down what people were saying at the bar. And I do it too, but I sit at the bar. And I wrote this one down, and the lady said, just like that, the lady said, what are you doing? I said, I'm writing down what you're saying. But I heard someone say, I heard that school is horrible. Apparently they don't even have an infrastructure.
See, that is so great.
I know.
Sometimes I'll overhear dialogue that I think will be great in story, and it's almost unbelievable. I was in Paris, and I heard a young woman said, she was trying to find this man she'd met, and she said he lives somewhere on Rue Street. And of course, Rue means street in French. And I wrote that down thinking what a funny line that would be. And every time I put it in, it just doesn't even work. It's hard to believe someone would be that daft. So
well, ever since Trump was elected, that's pretty much
that's true.
Everything every day. You couldn't write it.
No,
that's a
no. No, but that is a hard thing to write about, that it almost defies, when something defies intelligence, it also defies literature in a way. It becomes so reductive. And so I could totally see that, sort of like Rue Street.
You ever have a friend who likes to be the first one to call you to tell you that someone has cancer? I have.
Yeah, that the sort of, my wife and I will talk about this. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but the kind of competitive grieving that people do. Grief is so difficult. I hate to criticize anyone for the way they grieve, but there are people who do seem to take great joy in spreading bad news, or in being the first one to know, or suddenly the person who dies was their best friend, and you don't recall them ever even knowing that person. It's so odd.
The one person who does it the most, she's become very discriminating. She will only call me if it's stage 4. If it's stage 3, it's not worth her calling me. Stage 4, stage 5.
Gosh. That tells us the age we're getting to too, and someone
I know
can differentiate between cancer stages. I hope you write that story. I think it should just be called Stage 4. That would be an awesome short story.
See, and this is what you think about. You wouldn't call it stage 5.
No,
that's wrong.
No, and you could call it stage 3, but it's stage 4.
Stage 4.
Yeah.
I think there was
and the great thing about that, like if I'm thinking about a story, as soon as I think of the phrase stage 4, I think of the performative aspect of that kind of grief. I think of the stage. And, and so when I that very idea is exactly how a book of short stories comes about for me, is something that I have some connection to, and then I make a verbal connection, like that the word stage means performative grief as well as that level of cancer. So
it's like
I think you better get on that, Sam, after this.
Everyone always says that. I'm really good at exposition and dialogue. I never just have a story though. It's great talking, but it never gets to be. It's not that it's not a beginning, middle, and end. It just, never mind. We're not talking about.
But I know exactly what you mean. And there are many stories for me that start in some great world with dialogue and interesting characters. And it's hard to know when you turn the corner, when you venture out, and then at some point it goes somewhere. And I have stories that are just still venturing, they're still just launching.
It's like Groucho Marx. I would go to the Iowa Writers Workshop, except I would never belong to any group that will allow me in.
Yeah. I hear you there.
I'm trying to segue into Magnificent Desolation, but you haven't let me yet.
Sorry. Yeah.
But I remember when Buzz Aldrin said that because it was so. He was a cool guy. Do you remember when there was a stupid, well-known moon landing denier? And he got in Buzz Aldrin, he hit him in the back. Yeah, and then
that's in the story. That inspires,
right. I forgot.
Yeah, that inspires the middle school teacher who fed up with he has a student in Magnificent Desolation. He has a student who appears to be from religious parents and doesn't want to learn anything, and tells him, you can't tell me about angiosperms in biology because it has the word sperm, and you're not supposed to teach me sex, and we don't believe in geology because God made the earth 7,000 years ago. Fed up with this level of ignorance, willful ignorance, this teacher takes great inspiration in Buzz Aldrin, who was also like the character in that story. I was born on July 20th, but I was not born in 69. I was born in 65. So I was 4 during the moon landing. And the summer I got a stick in my left eye, I got the greatest toy, plastic model of the Apollo 11 rocket with the lunar lander, and I would just play it in my hospital bed. I would sit there and land the lunar module, and I would have Michael Carpenter circle the dark side of the moon while Buzz and Neil walked slowly. It's such a seminal moment for me. And so I sort of chose that as a kind of symbol of science denial, and the idea of Buzz just having enough and laying out, punching some moon landing denier.
He was 72 and the guy was 38. He just turned around and clocked him.
Yeah, it's still
Denier
a
goes,
wonderful moment.
Denier goes, did you get that on camera? Did you get that on camera? Which is exactly what a guy like that would do. But yeah,
it sort of like when Nolan Ryan beat up someone who charged the mound,
Yeah, he tried.
I got it on camera.
As soon as he got there, there was no hesitation.
Oh no, I got it on camera. Don't worry. Yeah.
Nolan Ryan was not the nicest guy, but I admired that moment.
Yeah,
my seminal moment with NASA was when I was like, and I followed the Mercury 7 so closely, but I wrote them a letter saying, I designed this rocket that was a double hull design. In the middle was this viscous fluid, so that if a meteorite hit it, the viscous fluid would close up the holes. And they were so nice. They wrote me back a letter. Thank you for your idea. We're going to keep it on file.
Wow. Yeah, that's impressive. I suppose, if they did fly, that would work with the Van Allen, or that would work if we went further out toward Pluto and we had to fly through that belt of asteroids.
Yeah.
So
Who knows?
That's funny.
The good thing about that story was it had a happy ending 2 different ways, and the other good thing was the one punctuation mark, because he goes angiosperm, but there's a question mark.
Yes. Yeah.
So
at the end,
so he's asking rather than telling. That was nice.
Yeah, thank you.
And then there's a couple of guys in the book, like in drafting, there's these 2 guys that are kind of losers, but then they turn out not to be losers, even though they got all kinds of bad habits. But I think one person, it's sort of one of the reasons that I called the book The Angel of Rome is one person's loser is another person's mentor or savior, or in that story, in drafting, another young woman, my mom died of cancer at 53. And so I find cancer working its way into my stories in these, almost inexplicable ways. But I was driving through when my mom was dying and I wanted so badly to keep her alive. I was driving through a mountain pass and I saw 2 cars doing that, one drafting off the other, driving so close. I still don't know why, to improve mileage. I can't possibly, it wasn't like a tailgating situation. They were clearly together because they did it for miles and miles. And I thought one car was towing the other, and it wasn't. It was just drafting off a bigger vehicle. And that was so amazing to me. But I remember thinking, I wish I could get my mom to draft off me. I wish she could use my strength and get close enough to me that I could pull her over this pass and keep her alive. And I couldn't. And when I started writing about this young woman and imagining who she would want to pull her through life, to keep her tethered to life, it was not people who had their shit together. It was, she describes it as when she looked back at her life, it was all a straight line, and then there was this jagged part. And the jagged part was the part she was the most interested in. So I sort of love that she chose Boone as this person to make her feel alive again after her terrible chemotherapy and radiation treatments. That this was as alive as she'd felt hanging out with this person who most of us would clearly look at her life and think it was a mistake. And again, I don't think she's thinking about getting back with him. She's just trying to remember a moment when she knew she was alive. And sometimes I think those are the moments, mistakes can make us feel as alive as successes sometimes. It's the way she says, okay. She goes, okay. Yeah, it's like,
yeah, okay. Yeah, she's up for anything. Yeah.
And that what you're saying about, I can't remember who wrote the book, that's the last word was altruism. It's like when your kids get sick, you do the same thing I do. You would rather take their sickness and have it yourself.
Totally. Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
altruism.
And you can't.
No,
Yeah,
you can't.
and you can't. No. And
But
it's the most heartbreaking thing. You know, and Boone in that story redeems himself. You know, he's you know, he knows what she needs. She just needs a little road trip. And because he's so hapless, his car breaks down. He doesn't know where his friends live. The van he buys looks like it might have been used by a serial killer.
but he
He's
doesn't
got to
get
get back.
he doesn't get
Yeah.
upset about anything. Like I would be so neurotic and I'd be, you know, yeah. And also, could you throw your phone out the window?
No. And I think, you know, the challenge of that story was showing you why she chose him, you know, and that I think, you know, was for me, by the end, I thought, I see why she chose him. And that there's that moment of kind of, you know, where you feel almost like you're looking at characters who you didn't create, but have their own attributes. And all of a sudden I understood her, you know, and why Boone was the one that she felt like, you know, could kind of take her away from the difficulty of her cancer treatment.
And we'll get to another guy that's kind of like that in another story. Yeah, so without me blabbing, you since the next one's the Angel of Rome, you explain it and also explain the collaboration too.
Yeah, the story really begins with collaboration. There's a terrific actor and audiobook performer named Eduardo Ballerini. And Eduardo did Beautiful Ruins. He read that story. And I was so taken by the job he did, both with the Italian and just with the range of characters. As Richard Burton is incredible. And so we talked about how interesting it would be to work on something together. And so Trastevere, this neighborhood in Rome, is both of our favorite places. So we sat down and said, well, we'll set it there. Eduardo had actually studied Latin in Trastevere as a young man. And that's about the only real element that makes its way into the story. The character of Nebraska Jack Ragel is nothing like Eduardo was. And, you know, I created a new class and all those things, but it was so much fun working with him. I would sort of interview him about various things, and we'd talk about different things we thought would go in the story. Then I would write some pages, send them to him. And Eduardo is also a terrific writer, so he would send back notes that really made the story better. And then I flew to New York during the pandemic, and we table read it almost like an actor in a play. And it was so fun to hear the lines that I'd written in the voices that he was choosing. And we would debate, you know, Ronnie Tower should sound like this. And Angelina, the actress that Jack Ragel, the story is about this student, Nebraska Jack Ragel, who finds himself running into this actress, Angelina Amadio, who he had seen in a movie when he was young. And he also bumps into a TV actor named Ronnie Tower. And he's studying Latin, but Ronnie Tower, either through ignorance or not hearing well, assumes he's studying Italian and immediately hires him as his translator, which gave all sorts of room for comic moments. And, you know, and I because I was working with Eduardo, I did sort of want to venture back into the same sort of world as Beautiful Ruins, to talk about acting and about Hollywood and about you know, dreams. It's a very different story, but it felt in many ways like I was kind of back in that world. And yeah, so that's kind of I don't want to give too much away about the story, but yeah, it's really a novella. It's the longest story I've ever written, and it really felt like the center of the book.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's right there. You know, it's funny because it's so cinematic, which reminded me of Beautiful Ruins. And I keep listening and waiting because it sounds like it's going to be a movie, but then it's not a movie yet. But is it still going to be a movie? Because it's
I mean, if you read my writing about, so I grew up next to a drive-in movie theater, and so I've always been fascinated by movies. And most of my books have been optioned, and some have been written into scripts, and some have been cast, and we've had directors attached. I had one movie canceled while I was in a plane with the director scouting locations. So I feel like if you're as cynical, as loving and cynical about Hollywood as I am, you have to sort of expect things to fall apart. So they get sort of close and then it falls back. And it's a pretty common Hollywood story. But if I've always said, if I'm the last word on the stories I created, I won't mind a bit. I'd rather be the last word than have a lesser film made from things.
Yeah.
But it's still in the hopper. It's still in some on some executive's desk. They're still talking about whether or not to make Beautiful Ruins.
Yeah, it's not as bad as like being called up to the Yankees and after 3 games getting sent back down to AAA. It's not like it's not that bad.
And I'm probably an outlier in this, but I think of literature as Major League Baseball and movies
Really?
as high AA in an inverted world in which you get paid more. But I would much rather write a novel than have a hit TV show. To me, I didn't grow up carrying a television around under my arm. I grew up wanting to write books, wanting to write these things, and so I feel like that's my real dream. And it is more lucrative to make movies and television, but if I was worried about money, I'd be a stockbroker. I wouldn't be a writer.
And I wouldn't be an independent bookseller.
Yeah, exactly right. Yes. And you'd have a cable company if it was all about television and movies or something. So yeah.
Well, so there's like, you can see I can't stop smiling when we talk about these stories because like there's so many funny things in there. But when Ronnie Tower walks into where they're trying to become fluent, and the Monsignor goes, Ronnie Tower, here's trouble.
Yeah. I had created the TV show Tower and Bridges in another short story a few years ago. I was just trying to write about, like, I just needed a 1980s television show, like Simon and Simon or something, or the Scarecrow and Mrs. King. There were just all these sort of investigative stories and these kind of detective stories. And so I'd sort of thought of that before, and again, it's just such a wonderful surprise when a character like Ronnie Tower just marches into a story, and he's irrepressible and a little bit of a wild card. And then Jack is taking Latin from Monsignor Festa, who is the most severe and who realizes that Jack doesn't speak Latin nearly as well as he promised he did. That even though he's taken intro to Latin twice, he claims he's had 2 years of Latin. He doesn't really explain that he just keeps taking the same intro over. So Jack already feels like he doesn't speak Latin, and then into the classroom marches Ronnie Tower, and it turns out it's Monsignor Festa's favorite show. And then of course there's another kind of, when you're writing something really comic like that, you just have these nice building blocks, and if you can put another block on top of the unlikely Monsignor being a movie buff, until pretty soon his Latin class is a writer's room. That's when we were describing making yourself laugh. I think it's remarkable how hard it can be to write and how much work it can be. And those moments when it's fun, when you're having fun, it's pretty good bet the reader is going to have fun with that story too.
Yeah, I can't stop smiling. And it's so funny because I remember what I did with Beautiful Ruins. I kept saying, everybody's nice, everybody's a good person. And it's kind of like this, you continue. There's no villains in here. Everyone's just nice in their own way. Except the closest what you come to is the nun, because she's like almost a passive aggressive, negative person. Which even she turns out to enjoy the process. But the funniest thing in the whole story is when the Monsignor says, here's trouble. and the really smart guy goes, "Hic est tribulation." That was
Translates it into Latin. Yeah.
I laughed the hardest. That was the funniest line in the book, and it's in Latin.
Yes, yeah, which I don't speak. I had to hire
I figured
Eduardo.
that.
Eduardo still speaks a little bit of Latin, but I have an Italian translator in Rome or in Italy that I work with sometimes, and she connected me with a Latin professor, and so I would run, my sort of guesses at what the Latin would be past him, and turned out my guesses were all completely wrong. But it's really fun writing a story with snippets of Italian and Latin, and writing about those moments. One of my favorite moments of the story, Jack doesn't really speak Italian, but he has this Italian phrase book, which I actually have. It's the first Italian phrase book I took to Italy in 1997. And so he's constantly referring to it when he has to translate. And so when he's asking Angelina out, would you like to go for a drive? Would you like to go to a discotheque? It was for me that there was another moment where, if you could have seen me writing that day, I was beaming and even laughing to myself. And then that was the other great thing about collaboration, is sent to Eduardo, and then laughing when I hear him read the lines out. That might have been the most enjoyable story I've ever written.
Yeah,
even though it took about 6 months, it was a long process, because I would write, send to him, he would record bits, I would listen, rewrite it, because of the collaboration, and also because it's almost, it's half a novel. It's quite a long story. It took quite a bit of time.
It's funny, but I was going to say something and it was a spoiler, but I can't imagine why it would be a spoiler, but it is. But I will say this about both Beautiful Ruins and this. It's essentially it's like about fluency, the whole thing. And then the other thing is, like, it's about how life just happens to you, like that movie Sliding Doors. Everything just happened to happen. And then I won't spoil it.
But fluency is a great word for what we're sort of doing in life. We are becoming fluent in living, and just about the time we speak it well enough, we're starting our downhill decline. Just about the time we learn life well enough to speak it fluently, we near the end. And that's what I love about a long story like this, is you can use time the way you do in a novel. So we can see what happens to Jack Ragel 20 years later. We can see what happens to Ronnie and Angelina. And to me, that gives a kind of depth to a story that we don't always get in short stories.
And then you have like Clarissa out there, it's like,
yeah.
And that's
a romantic red herring.
Yeah, and that's where I go, yes, and that's where afterwards I go, yeah, I'm sitting there going, what the hell? Why didn't didn't they,
Because the writer is devious, and he wants you to look to the left. The writer is a magic trick doing this with his left hand while he pulls your wallet out with his right.
Yeah, I was looking at her. I was looking at her thinking, okay, well, he'll go,
Yeah.
I would like to go out with her.
Yeah. I think the story, I had that realization that what a lovely thing if you can write a romance story that isn't about the romance you expect, and that was, what ended up happening.
There were two different romances you expected. Well, okay, I'm stopping.
Yeah.
So, okay, next one before you blow. And here I go again. So I practiced law in Florida for 30 years. And the first time I realized that lawyers could advertise, I was so disgusted. And I filed a lawsuit against the Florida bar. I said, you can't do this.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like, why would you hire an attorney because of a billboard or a sign on the side of a bus? It just makes no sense. And you're just going to get screwed. And it's just like, but anyway, the thing about that story is that, there he is on the bench, but also, and this is really sad, is when he would, all right, I don't want to spoil it either, but if you see someone standing there, it reminded me, unfortunately, what's happened in the past 2 weeks, like what happened in Texas with those 19 kids. They're standing for an hour.
Yeah. No, it's interesting that that story was sort of percolating, and I don't know where coming up with a bus bench advertising called Joe Before You Blow came from, but that just that idea made me laugh, and then imagining on a bus bench. But I really just wanted to write another story about a moment that you expect one thing and something else happens, and that, to me, that's a very comic story that gets really tense for a moment and then, has a resolution that I really ended up liking. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's, well, okay. Well, yeah. If you go to Town and Country, the whole time when I realized where he was going to be going, I thought, I would like to be a little bit older so that I could go there.
Yeah, I try to stay away from strict autobiography, but my dad was a lifetime smoker and drinker, and he has severe Alzheimer's. And when we were first looking for a place for him, I would say, can he smoke? And they'd be like, no, he can't smoke. But he can have a cocktail, right? And they're like, no, he can't have a cocktail. And so I almost wrote an entire story just inventing a place to land my sweet father, who had lived his life a certain way and, and didn't really fit in the world anymore. And so I created, the idea of the Town and Country, which is an old motor hotel where they don't really, take care of you. They just treat you the way you'd want to be treated, especially of that generation. So, they have a menu with big 16-point font where you can order a London broil or a Tom Collins, and the prices are $2.50, for the meatloaf. And I just started thinking of the joy that it would give my dad to think he was getting a two in there are paying way more for that. You have the agency to be ordering your own food. So it was kind of just inventing the place I wish existed for my dad, and then writing a short story about it with, quite a few differences in the story. But we did end up finding a place where my dad could have 1 beer and 2 cigarettes a day.
And Town and Country could not get a license.
Not Town and Country, but much better care than I suspect he would have gotten.
Yeah, I like the way the prices, those were the prices, but they weren't the prices that you would get in the mail.
Right, exactly. No, your bill's going to be way higher.
Astronomical. And the other thing about that story, which was cinematic, was the last 2 lines when he asked, and she says, that's the way we always say.
Yes, he says, it's one of my favorite moments too, the son. And the other thing about that story was imagining, having to repeat things to my dad over and over and over. No, mom died many years ago. No, this is your house. And imagining that one of the hardest things would be if you were gay and having to come out to your father over and over and over, this sort of Sisyphean coming out. And so it became a story about that, about the main character coming out to his father over and over. And when he finally gets him settled at the Town and Country, he goes to leave, and I don't think this is giving anything away, but the father calls his name, and he turns he says one more. He turns and he thinks he's talking to him, but he's talking to the waitress who's just taken his order, and he says, "Make it a double." And the very last line of the sentence is, "We always do, honey." And it just was such a lovely moment for the dad, but also kind of thematically underscored the idea, of the way this father lived his life, and the way and the place that he's landed.
And the way you're so cinematic is what I was going to say was, after that line, you could just see the movie just fade out, just fade to gray.
Yeah.
It would fade
I do think a childhood spent in a tree fort watching drive-in movie theater affected the way I see film and see stories. Yeah.
Okay, well, so this was really short. This is the shortest one, Cross the Woods, right?
Yeah. I think so, yeah.
So did your dad teach you how to tie a tie like that?
No, actually, that came from a writing assignment. It was by Esquire. Esquire magazine said, write a story called How to Be a Man. And um, and so it was just a really brief. Sometimes I love a kind of palate cleansing story for myself. I just want to write one quick moment and incident. So woman wakes up thinking that the guy that she sometimes sleeps with has sketched off again in the middle of the night. And most of the story is her just lying in bed thinking about that. And as the story opens up, you realize it's the night after her father's wake, that she got a babysitter and brought this man Marcus home, that she knew what she was getting, that he was going to leave. And then again, most of these stories I wrote during the last 9 years, during difficult times for my family and me and almost everyone I knew politically. And I was really looking for little moments of hope and those little angels, those little moments that surprise you, grace notes almost. And so this is a story that moves toward a grace note and Marcus teaching her son how to tie a tie. And no, I was taught by an uncle. My dad was a blue collar guy who never wore a tie. I had to tie his tie at my mother's funeral. So we had the opposite. We had me behind him tying the first tie he'd worn since he was a kid, probably, and his mom put a tie on him. So, but I had an uncle who taught me, and I've taught nephews, taught my son. I consider it one of the few rights of manhood that I really agree with, which is, I've also taught my daughters how to tie ties. So I consider it one of this kind of lovely thing to pass on. So it seemed like a nice thing to end a story with.
My father, who didn't teach me how to tie a tie, whenever he saw me in a tie, he goes, I've never seen anyone tie a worse tie than you.
Yeah.
Because
you can get it wrong, that's for sure.
I can't tie a Windsor. I can't tie. Can you do those? Can you do like a full?
Oh, I can do every tie. I had
Really?
to wear a tie as a journalist for 8 or 9 years, and you can do a Windsor, a double Windsor. I can't do a cravat. I can't do a cravat or an ascot. But you give me a regular necktie, and I'm a wizard. It's like balloon animals. I can make just about anything. So
yeah, that sucks.
A lot of it is the material of the tie you use. I grew up with kind of crappy ties. You get a nice silk tie and you can make alligators. You can do anything with them.
Well, when you have a spread collar, for me it sucks because you can see.
Yeah.
But you do the Windsor and then it fills the whole area.
I even learned to do a bow tie because just in case I ever win an award worthy of one. So
now I admire you more for that than as a writer.
I think for me as a blue collar kid, first generation college student who didn't go on an airplane until I was in my 20s, it was a sort of class, a kind of class aspiration to learn how to tie different ties. I wanted to be more than the people I grew up with. The valedictorian from my high school joined the Navy, and I wanted more than that. And so I think learning things like that was my way of imagining myself into a class that I felt I didn't belong to.
Yeah, Across the Woods had that same double happy ending that Magnificent Desolation did, and it involved a kid.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess I don't ever think of them as happy endings so much as an ending that completes some movement in the story, and that can be towards something happy. It can be towards something. I guess I think of them as satisfying.
Yeah, that's why how you think Steinbeck is too sentimental, so he doesn't go into your triumvirate of religious.
Yeah.
So
sure.
Yes, in Steinbeck, like Cannery Row, and the bums give him that whatever it is, tie rod that they've polished up and all that gets a little cloying.
Yeah. Although I think the older I get, the more I love that kind of stuff. Though, if it's earned, it has to. And these, as I said, these were hopeful stories. This was me trying to look past whatever biases I might have developed as a younger writer and saying, what's satisfying about people connecting, and trying to write to those moments.
Well, you did in the next story, which was a nice segue. The next story, which I would imagine, unless you tell me otherwise, would be the hardest one to write, would be To the Corner, because the vernacular, and then again, the fact that, they're all kids. That's the other thing. You expect at the beginning, these kids are not going to be good kids.
Yeah.
Then they're good kids.
I was a reading tutor at the kind of rough school. I live in the neighborhood that I describe in that story, which in the 90s and 2000s was the school with 99% free and reduced lunch, and just a very poor neighborhood. And so I would get to know these kids as a reading tutor when they were in 3rd and 4th grade, and then I would play basketball with them in the park after that. And I was always struck by how funny and smart they were, and how well they hid their humor and their intelligence. They were, and so I just wanted to sort of, I live in the Boone, in that neighborhood that they live in, and it's like a lot of places, it's really gentrified since then. But the core of the neighborhood is still very diverse, very, very poor, working class. And when I see those kids, they still, we just, the way they're able to crack me up just amazes me. So yeah, it was a hard story to write. And when you're writing, vernacular, you have to be careful. But we all speak in vernacular. Leonard speaks in his own vernacular. Ronnie Tower speaks in his own vernacular. I think the key is making it specific. These kids, it's 2007, and there's a substation cop who thinks they must be drug dealers, so they talk like kids in The Wire, and they've just heard up in the, we live up in the Boone, Asim up in the karate dojo with his dad, and what a kid who's been away for a few months comes back and hears them talk that way and just gets it immediately. And I wanted to write about that, the way when you're young, slang isn't something you pick up, it's something you intuit.
So they're all in honors classes.
Yeah, they're bright kids. Yeah, I mean, the kids that I tutored often were bright kids. 2 of them are in honors classes. I don't think Doug B is headed for honors.
Oh yeah, I feel bad for him.
I feel terrible for Doug B. He's the they don't even know another Doug. They just call him Doug B, which cracked me up.
But they do kind of accept him. They don't really
Totally.
They aren't cruel to him.
They're a group of friends, and and it's a story about, an older man, Leonard, who lives across the street from these kids, and that is one of my favorite lines in the whole collection, because Leonard's kids, his wife has died, and Leonard is a widower living by himself, and across from this corner where these kids gather all summer and take their shirts off and walk around with their saggy pants. And Leonard's kids give him the worst advice. His son brings him a gun to protect himself. And Leonard has that thought: you can love your kids more than anything, but sometimes you suspect they're the ripest assholes in the whole world. And I just love that about Leonard, that that he doesn't fall for the things that his son especially wants him to think.
That was another red herring you did. Because that saying about if there's a gun in the first act, it has to go off in the fifth.
Yeah.
I was 100% sure. I was 100% sure, especially when he started giving. I'm not going to give.
When he walks across the street to confront the boys about something that is really unexpected.
I have presence.
Yeah, and it's kind of the anti-Clint Eastwood story, but right. I think it's a truer moment, though. I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and what Leonard says about it is what I think, that everyone's outside, and it's the thing I've written about this before. The thing I love about Spokane is you're never more than 3 blocks from a bad neighborhood, and that makes people in Seattle look down at it. But to me, that kind of mixed economic diversity is as important as any other kind of diversity. And I would never live in would never move to the South Hill or one of the wealthier neighborhoods in Spokane. I like living in a place that feels real. We have this thing in Spokane called Porch Fest, where everyone goes out on their porch and plays music and offers their neighbors food and something to drink. And the diversity of what you hear during Porch Fest just makes me so happy.
That's really cool. Doug B does like I do, like if someone says to you, did you ever read this book? And you should have read it. You go, yeah, I read it a while ago. I don't remember. He just repeats the last word.
Yes, yeah. Doug B doesn't get any of their jokes, but it either references, but he laughs at them anyway. That someone says that the girls at this school are so stuck up, you need a Sherpa to talk to them, and Doug B's like Sherpa, Yeah, I get the sense that whatever company Doug B is working for now, he's probably still the same, quarterly reports. So, yeah.
Well, that reminded me of the other funniest thing was when Ronnie comes to, and he goes, hey girls, or whatever he goes, and Jack goes, here's trouble.
Yes, and Jack says, yeah, the refrain is, it's funny you call this an album, because it's amazing how many times you think musically, that's the refrain, that's the chorus for that song.
It's, the famous actor. So I was at Lincoln Center one time, and I was walking into the bathroom, and Richard Gere was walking out.
Oh, wow.
And he looks at me and he goes, hey, how you doing? Like that, regular guy. And I go, oh, good, thanks, man. And I go into the bathroom and I think, shouldn't I be doing something?
Yeah.
I'm just going to the bathroom, but shouldn't I not go? I realized,
yeah,
no,
right.
That's it. That's all there is. I was at the Bel Air Hotel and I walked by Lauren Bacall, and she just smiled at me. And I smiled back, and then I left, and I thought, well, wait a minute. That was Lauren Bacall. I got to do it.
Shouldn't something else happen? Yeah. That story was fun to write it. And it was just sort of imagining what would happen if a famous actor had a one-night stand with someone who becomes like a very funny critic. But the great surprise of that story was how uninteresting he was and how interesting she was to me. And the thing that the thing that I kept expecting to happen sort of never did, which and he became the sort of character who just wants her to think that he's normal like her, that he's regular, that he's not some entitled person, but is approachable in some way. And that neediness for me was so.
Yeah, it reminded me when he was taking the non-existent tobacco.
Yeah, off his tongue. Yeah.
That reminded me when he was standing on the bank when the car goes down, to a much lesser extent.
Yeah.
But the thing about her that was great is she was totally unstarstruck.
Totally unstarstruck. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, and she had such a clear-eyed vision of his film career and his filmography. Often there's a line in a story that I remember writing and laughing at. And that one, it's that, they have this one night stand, and she thinks that having sex with a stranger is like trying to find a spoon in someone else's kitchen. Like you try all the drawers, and I just the awkwardness of their one night stand to me was so much fun to write.
When I go into a kitchen, I'm like you with ties. I always say, "Where's the junk drawer?"
Yeah, right.
You always find the junk drawer.
Yeah, there's always. I think our whole kitchen might be junk drawers. I'm not sure.
I thought, you did a couple. That's another red herring, because I thought, okay, he might not be great, but he might be decent. And then
you said there were no bad people in the.
Well, he's only bad. He's only really bad because of that last part, which.
Well, and I don't think he is. I mean, I think.
No.
If you think of a character like Humbert, who is, a pedophile murderer, but the great thing about fiction is that you embody characters that are unlike you in so many ways, but everyone has their justifications, everyone has their reasons, the way that they see themselves, their delusions. And the famous actor has his sort of deluded sense of himself.
It's like your buddy Kurt Vonnegut when he's writing when Kilgore Crowd is in it, and he's writing about Dwayne Hubler, and he says it's just chemicals. I interviewed his son, who's a doctor.
Oh, did you? Mark? Yeah.
He talked about that. Yeah, he gave apparently his father some lines, but his father never attributed, never told him.
Yeah, that happens with kids.
So next one is balloons. Would you have guessed balloons, or would you have said tires? What would you say?
I did. I was watching that episode and I thought tires. And yeah, it's that's another really short story and a kind of simple one, but it has a lot of air and a lot of white space. And what I wanted that story to do was, to be a different kind of coming of age story. And in that moment, when they're watching this, again, this doesn't give anything away about the story, but they're watching Family Feud, and the question is, name something you fill with air, and the heavy drinking, amorous neighbor lady says lungs, and he says tires, or vice versa. And the number one answer is balloons. And they both just go, balloons. Like, why didn't I think of that? And that to me was a kind of really quick metaphor about what it is to come of age. The most obvious things you miss. And you're filled with wonder about things that saw you later. And in that brief moment, both for Victor and for Mrs. Ahern across the street, it's just that realization of how simple life can seem at sometimes.
The reason why I thought about that one, because I don't know why his brother hung up. I mean, he must have had a different experience.
Well, I think the brother's having the brother had an affair with Mrs. Ahern across the street. And when the kid calls, the brother's kind of on edge, like, mom has me helping out with Mrs. Ahern across the street. And the brother's like, oh shit, what's going on? But the brother doesn't want to admit it. He's got a new girlfriend. And so he thinks that his brother's about to talk about that, but then instead the brother says, don't you think I should be paid extra? Don't you think it should be an hourly wage if I mow her lawn? And the brother's like, my brother's still a child, and he hangs up. So I kind of love that moment. And I talked about how there's a lot of kind of air in that story, kind of white space. And it's kind of moments that you don't explain. And I can write in a lot of different registers, but sometimes I love writing in a kind of minimalism where you leave off before you say everything that happened, where the story is a little bit off the page.
Even the last question and answer, the same thing.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah.
So that gets to the last one, and it's called The Angel of Rome, the book, but in some ways I almost think that's the most important story. I don't know why.
It's in many ways it's very about it's about two climate professors during the storm of the century there, interviewing for the same job. And it's also a very comic story, but it's written in the register of that when I decided to write it as if it were a horror story called The Way the World Ends. But instead of being a horror story, it's a kind of comic sort of romance. And again, it's for me, the building of the story is often about structure and form. And I wrote that one in 7 chapters. Johnny Cash makes a very unlikely appearance. And it became as important to the collection for me as The Angel of Rome, because it's, I talked about how the first word in the collection is mother, and the last word of that story is father, and the last word of The Way the World Ends is hope. And which is what I sort of wanted to end the collection with, this idea that can feel like as you age, the time we're in now politically, environmentally, it can feel sort of hopeless. And almost every one of these stories was about me trying to find my way honestly towards some sense of hope. And I think that that's where the characters, hopefully arrive at the end of that story.
I've found that you really can't sell a book anymore unless it either has the apocalypse or dystopia. So at least you got that in there, which I can push.
My last story collection had a zombie story right smack in the middle, called
but your zombie stories aren't the zombies.
Called Don't Eat Cat. It was very much a zombie. No, it was not a zombie story. It was a kind of zombie story. And but yeah, I think like all writers, you have to sort of ignore fashion and write into the things that are the closest to you. And so yeah, it's a pretty political story. I know, it's when you have two climate scientists. I had someone ask me if I felt, like it was right to write a political story. And the fact that it makes me as angry as Magnificent Desolation, the idea that science has somehow become political. It's it's to me one of the great disappointments of modern life is that we have to agree upon the most basic fundamental facts.
Well, it's like you talk about in the story, the grants drying up, and that's not like fiction. That's exactly
right
is happening. It should.
Yeah. Exactly.
You're on the hope side. I'm on the Kafka side on that one. But
yeah, I don't think there's as much separating those two sides as we imagine.
I understand that. I guess. I don't know. All right, so
I mean, the act of writing is such a hopeful act that I think of Kafka as an incredible optimist.
I don't know if you're writing Metamorphosis in one night. I don't know if you are feeling that great.
Probably not feeling that great, but when you finish that story, when people respond to it, Kafka used to have these readings where the listeners would just sit around and howl in laughter at the stories he wrote. Well, you can't tell me that's there. It is in
front of me.
Yeah, Kafka always believed he was writing great comedy.
Yeah, well, it is. Oh, there's a book after this by a guy named Mark Estrin called The Half-Life of Gregor Samsa.
Oh, really? Yeah.
It turns out the charwoman sweeps him out, but he's not dead, and he becomes like this. He becomes like this guy. He becomes an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh wow! What a great premise. That's terrific.
Really good.
Yeah.
But okay, so we've been talking an hour and a quarter. So last question. How did you feel the first time you saw Eraserhead?
The first time I saw Eraserhead, I felt a little nauseous, honestly. That's so funny. Yeah, that era of, I was trying to figure out what movies Jack Riegel would have seen at the art house theater, and I remembered being a freshman in college or maybe a senior in high school and seeing Eraserhead and just thinking, like, I did not need to see that. That was disturbing in so many ways, but also intrigued. And there are a lot of movies from 1982 or whenever that was that I don't remember, but I remember that movie clearly. So it must have made an impact, made a dent somewhere.
On both of us. And then it's David Lynch, it's like amazing. But
yeah.
Anyway, totally. Well, thanks for, I'll see you again in 10 years. Who knows what we'll be doing if I'm
10 years. Yeah. Right.
I
will be, I'll be writing about an old man living in Italy then. So yeah.
You're going to be me or you?
Hopefully one of us. Yeah.
Okay, Jess. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Sam.
The Angel of Rome. Oh, wait a minute.
Yes.
Hold up the book again. So we'll both hold it up. There. And it's a great
Rome.
It's a great.
This is the new hardcover which just arrived. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks
for those great questions. Yeah. Take care, Sam.
You too. Bye-bye.